right. Welcome, everybody, to another Developer Hours. My name is Nick Diego, and I'm a full-time core contributor and work sponsored by Automatic. And I'm joined by my co-host, Ryan Welcher. Ryan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm also a developer advocate sponsored by Automatic. I work with Nick, as he just said. I've been a developer for 20 years, something like that. You can find me on the webs at Ryan Welcher or Ryan Welcher Codes.
Awesome.
Over to you.
So today we are going to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. It's about extending core WordPress blocks. So in the presentation today, we're going to kind of try and answer the question of why would you want to extend core WordPress blocks as opposed to something like building your own custom blocks, and also kind of walk through some different ways that you can do that. And hopefully by the end of this session, you will have a sense of how you could go about building your own extensions and hopefully have a bunch of resources to do so. So I'm going to share a link to a Google Doc. There are going to be a lot of resources or references that I'm going to be referencing in this presentation. And I figured having a nice little Google Doc where everybody can see all of those links and have them handy would be very helpful because there's going to be lots of them. In this discussion of extending WordPress blocks, you could probably do a 2-week seminar on extending WordPress blocks. So we're going to be going pretty quickly today, but I want to provide kind of an overview. But each item that we're going to cover, again, could have its own dedicated session. So there's a lot of great links there for you to dive in, learn more about each section. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to kind of go through this setup about how we're going to approach this topic. And let me just start sharing my screen right now. Okay. So what you should see is you should see the 2024 theme. And I'm just using a very basic local WordPress installation. The 2024 theme was just released with 6.4 earlier in November. And it's a really great theme if you haven't tried it out already, because it includes some of the concepts that I'm going to be talking about today. I like to learn by doing. So instead of just talking about concepts, we're actually going to build something or look at some live examples and try to solve a problem through extending core blocks. And the problem that I want to solve today is we're going to go back into the back end here, go to pages, and go to this page that I have set up. Now, this is using one of the patterns from 2024. And you can see here that we have a design that it's a columns block. So if we open up our list view, you can see it's a columns block. And we have text on the left and an image on the right. On mobile devices, when we go to tablet, this is what we might want it to look like, where the image is actually on top and the text is below. By default, WordPress the columns block does not do this. By default, the image would be below the text. Now, there are ways that you can accomplish this with CSS, and that's what we're going to start with. Some of you who may be well-versed in accessibility will know that using CSS to do this is not always the best practice. So by the end of the discussion, we'll show a way to do it accessibly with JavaScript. But basically what we're trying to solve for is this type of design where we have an element on the right that looks great on desktop, but on mobile, we want that item to appear first. And you see this a lot in web design. And this is not something that the native columns block supports. So how can we go about applying this functionality to the columns block? Basically, we want to extend the columns block with this functionality that on mobile, it reverses direction. Now, you might think, well, this is just a CSS class, right? You could just add a CSS class, add some CSS that makes this work. And you're 100% right. And that's where we're going to start. So what I've done is I have basically created a child theme of the 2024 theme, just as a way for us to work easier without, so if there's any updates to the 2024 theme, those updates aren't kicking out my customizations. But let's head over here to a theme that I created called TT4 Sandbox. This is just a child theme of the 2024 theme. And all I have is I copied over the screenshot and I have my functions.php file. The first way I'm going to solve this problem is by creating a block style. Now, the great thing about 2024 is the 2024 theme actually includes its own block styles. Block styles are a fantastic tool which allow the user to easily add a CSS class to a block. So you might be familiar with this with buttons. So if we're looking at a button here and we open up the sidebar, under here we can see this little outline or fill. Those are block styles. That allows the user a nice UI to add a class. You might be noticing this little icon settings here. We'll talk about this later. This is an extension plugin that we'll talk about in a second. But when I toggle this, you can see that the CSS class changes. And the CSS is being driven to these classes that update the style of the button here. Now, in the document that I shared in the chat earlier, there's some great resources on how to register a block style, and also a link to the 2024 theme where you can kind of see that in action. But if we look quickly with our code here, we can see that we're using this function called register block style. We're targeting the columns block, and we're giving it a label. And then we're passing some inline styles. So we're saying we want to create a block style called reverse on mobile, for lack of a better name. We have some CSS here that's handling that for us. So now if we go back to this design and go to columns, when we go to our little styles panel here, we can see that we have a block style called reverse on mobile. If I turn to default, let me just double check something here quickly. We are a style default. And if I go to tablet, you can see that this is the default implementation. The image is below. If I click on reverse on mobile, now the image is on top. So we've extended the core block in the simplest way possible with this default block styles API that basically makes it easy for the user to add a class. And then the styling, you can see here, it allows you to pass some inline styles, which are then applied to the block. And you can see it's targeting here with that class. The simplest approach to add some customizations to a block. At this point, do we have any questions, Ryan? Does not look like we do.
Nothing in chat so far.
Perfect. Okay, so how do we make this better? Block styles are really great. And if you want to do some simple things, block styles are really a great way to customize your theme. 2024 does an excellent job of that by adding some additional functionality to things like the details summary block and things like that. We can take this a step further by block variations. Some of you may have attended, Ryan and I actually did a hallway hangout earlier, I believe in September, completely dedicated to block variations, and I'll cover them briefly here. But block variations is another way to basically create a variant of a block that has some preset functionality. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back over to my TT4 sandbox example. I'm going to turn off the block style because we don't need the block style anymore. And I'm going to turn on this function here that is enqueuing actually, let me back up quickly. So we saw here that the block style was using inline styles. And basically, there's no CSS style sheet that's powering our block style. This is all inline, it's handling it with the register block style. You can also register style sheets at the block level. And we'll actually see this in later examples because this is very handy. So instead of And you can do this from a theme or a plugin. We're doing this from a child theme here, but you could also do this from a plugin. So here what we're doing is we are enqueuing a dedicated style sheet for the columns block. There's a lot of benefits to this. One of these is that it's more performant because on the front end, if the columns block isn't on the page, the style sheet won't actually get loaded. So it detects if the block actually exists on the page, then it applies these styles. So as we start talking about variations, we need to register our style sheet somehow that contains the styles we need to reverse that column direction. So that's what we're doing here. We're basically enqueuing a style sheet. It's called columns. I put it in my assets folder. And it just has the same styles that we were applying to a block style with our block style. And I'm enqueuing it here. Then down here, I have registered my JavaScript file. So block variations need to be registered in JavaScript, unlike block styles, which can be registered in PHP. So for a block variation, we need to enqueue a JavaScript file. Here, we're going to call it variations.js, and you can see it under my JS variations. And we're going to be using the enqueue block editor assets to do that. And there's a great article in the developer documentation on how to enqueue assets into the editor. We're going to be talking about this all session. So that's a great article to reference on how to enqueue, whether it's styles, whether it's scripts, into the editor, because the variation needs to be available in the editor. Again, there's some nuance to how you set up the variations, and there's great our Holloway Hangout was great. I also wrote an article recently on an introduction to block variations. There's all sorts of cool stuff you can do with them. This example is relatively simple, but if we come over to our variations.js file, it's very simple. We're registering a variation for core columns block. We're giving it a name. We're going to call it reverse direction on mobile. We're going to give it a title. And with variations, you can predefine any of the attributes on a block. So a great example of this is the group block. So the group block is actually the main block, and then stacks and rows are variations of the group block. So even though they appear as separate blocks when the inserter, so if we go to row, for example, it appears as its own block, it's actually a variant of the group block. Very handy depending on how you want your users to interact with your variations. Instead of the block styles, which are, they have to come into the block itself and switch the block style, variations can act like their own blocks in many ways. So what we're going to do here is, again, create a variation. And the only thing that's different about this variation from a default columns block is we're giving it a custom class. This seems a little silly because we're basically doing the exact same thing that the block style did, where it's adding a custom class, but we're just doing it in a different way with a variation. You can get way more complicated with a variation. I'm going to share this link so Ryan doesn't have to. Ryan has put together a fantastic plugin called the Advanced Query Loop. This shows you kind of a way to, let me share it to everyone here. This shows you a way to really take variations to the next level. So if you're really looking how to build really complicated variations, I encourage you to take a look at the plugin that he has built there. But our variation is very simple. We're just, whenever somebody inserts this block variation, it's going to have this class name, which is going to do the exact same thing that our block style did. It's going to use these block styles to reverse the direction on mobile. So let's see what this looks like. We're going to refresh the page here. Now, when we look at our columns block, let's make sure that we saved here. So we have our variation. Oh, we didn't save our functions. There we go. Okay. Now when we refresh, go to our columns block, we can now see that we have transformed to variation. And we can transform it to columns reverse on mobile. When I search for columns, I can also see that I now have another block that is columns reverse on mobile. Now, this is not the greatest implementation. You might not want to have this, but it is a demonstration of the different ways that you can apply the same functionality, whether in a block style or a variation. Both have their strengths and weaknesses. Variations are really useful. Like, for example, if you have the search block, core search block, and you want to restrict the search to just posts or just pages, easy to do with a variation. Can't do that with a block style because variations allow you to modify the attributes on a block. Also here, variations have some interesting functionality where you can they kind of tie into the transform functionality. So I can transform this columns block into one that reverses on mobile. And when I do that, I can see that I have my class gets applied. So two different ways to do the exact same thing. But again, you can, depending on what you're trying to do, one may be better than the other. But honestly, this implementation isn't the best because if you look at the sidebar for the columns block, we have this nice toggle that stacks the columns on mobile. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a similar little toggle here that allowed us to reverse direction on mobile? That might be from a user experience perspective, that might be probably, well, in my opinion, the best implementation. So this starts to get us beyond block styles, beyond block variations, into the realm of actually extending the core block itself with an extension plugin. Extension plugins, there are many of them that exist out there in the ecosystem. And as you start looking at them and working with them, you'll realize that they kind of all have a same formula for how you apply these extensions to core blocks. Now, before we get into those and start looking at some of those examples, I do want to stress that modifying a block on the front end is quite easy to do. We have, and I'll talk about this in a bit, but we have a filter called render block that allows you to basically do whatever you want with the output of a block. Modifying a block in the editor is a bit more challenging because modifying so for example, if I wanted to modify what you see here with this image, I can do that, but it requires you kind of modifying the functionality of the block itself. And basically you start interacting with core functionality that might be tricky. So I'm going to try to navigate us through that. But I do want to note that you have a lot more flexibility to modify things on the front end than you do in the editor itself. So you might see extension plugins that provide settings basically in the block that you might not see in the editor. But when you look at it on the front end, you will see those changes. So let's take a look at a few extension plugins. Before though, I do want to shout out an article series that Justin Tadlock, who's here with us today, put together on the WordPress developer blog. The article series is called Beyond. Let me just pull it up here. And Ryan can share the link in the chat here. So Justin put together an article series called Beyond Block Styles. And this basically takes you through what I'm going to be talking about with a different example for the rest of this session. Basically, started with a block style, kind of what I just showed you, and then building on that all the way up until you have like an extension plugin where you built a custom UI that allows people the users to make changes within the interface. So this is a great article series if you kind of want to read through it, kind of like a tutorial. I highly recommend this. But let's look at some examples of what you could possibly do with an extension plugin. The first one I want to shout out is one by Aki Hermano. He's a core contributor, and he built an extension plugin called, let me get to the correct name of it. I think it's called Enable. There we go. And Ryan can share the link in the chat here. It's called Enable Responsive Image. And this was really cool. And this is what kind of got me excited about this. Even though I had built extension plugins in the past, it kind of got me excited about creating like one-off extension plugins, and kind of was the impetus for this talk as well. So let's look at what this thing does. So in the editor, this panel is being added by Aki's plugin. And what it allows you to do is, let's choose, I don't know, Mars. What this allows you to do is create different images that get swapped out at different viewports. So for example, at 600 pixels, we want this image to instead show Mars. Let's assume that's what we want to do. If I look at my template here, you can see that nothing changed in the editor. Now, Aki has built a really cool functionality for the editor. I'll show you in a second. But let's update this. Go look at the front. And we'll look at the view here. And you can see as we adjust this, now we have Mars. So this is a really cool functionality, because a lot of times maybe on a desktop, you might have an image that looks really good, wide, but then maybe on mobile, you want to swap that out with either a lower res image or perhaps a image that is maybe the proportions are a little bit better. So this is a really cool little plugin that allows you to do that. Now, I do want to stress that this is still in development and you can view it on GitHub, but it's a cool little application of how you can extend a core block without having to create your own. Now, Aki is a core developer and a far better developer than I am, and he built this really cool functionality where you can enable the image preview inside of the editor. You can do this, so I want to show that this is definitely possible, but a little bit more challenging than some of the examples that I'm going to show you. But when we click on this and we look at mobile, you can see that Mars is flipped over. Now, there are some concessions you have to make here, right? Like you don't have all the other settings in the toolbar while you're previewing. But as soon as you disable preview, it goes back to the original, and then you can make modifications. So again, cool little editor-focused modification to the block that allows you to preview things. All right. The other one, which I inadvertently showed off earlier, was a example plugin that I built, which allows you to add icons to button blocks. So again, this panel did not exist previously. And this is just a little panel that allows you to add an icon to the button. You can change this out, so on and so forth. There are many advanced button plugins out there that allow that a completely separate button block that adds a button to the interface, and it has all sorts of functionality that maybe the core button block does not have. So you might be wondering, why shouldn't you build a custom block? That's a question I don't want to answer. You of course can, if it meets your needs, great. But one of the benefits about building off of a core block is that core blocks are always being improved by the vast community. And so if there's functionality that a core block naturally gets with each WordPress release, by extending the core block, you're already getting all that additional functionality. With this button example, one of the things that was recently released in 6.4 was that you can now add button blocks to navigation. So if we come over here to the site editor, the navigation block is pretty limited in what you can add. There's a limited set of blocks that you can add to the navigation block. And they recently added the button block. Now, if you had built a custom button block, you wouldn't be able to add your button to the navigation, but by extending the core button block, by the new benefit that the button block has to be added to navigation, all of a sudden, your extension just works in navigation, which is cool. So there's definitely pros and cons to both approaches, but I personally try and think about, can I extend a core block for additional functionality before I jump to building a custom block? And I found that to be very beneficial. This is not a self plug, but one of the plugins that I kind of started out building and really learned how the block editor works and learned about block development was a plugin called Block Visibility that allows you to set conditional visibility for blocks in WordPress. This, because it's an extension, it can be applied to any block in WordPress. So that's another benefit. Instead of just having to build an extension for a single block, you can build an extension that applies to all blocks or a set of blocks. So there's a lot of different things to think about when extending, but extending, I think, is a really great way to enhance the WordPress ecosystem and enhance core blocks with functionality that might not make sense in core, might be fairly niche, but useful for a lot of people, but maybe don't make sense in core. So that's my little soapbox pitch for why you might want to extend a core block. Now, I want to stop there before we jump into the full-blown example of continue with our reversing columns. Do we have any questions in the chat?
Nothing's coming up. I haven't seen anything. It's full of links right now.
All right. I assume at this point, everybody knows how to build block styles and block variations. So if not, feel free to always message us afterwards and whatnot. But hopefully those links are helpful. Okay, so now what we're going to try and do is do the same thing that we have with this example, with this button block or with that image, responsive image block that I showed you. We want to build basically a UI that does this column reversal that makes it feel a little bit more native than either a variation or a block style. So I've already built this plugin, and Ryan, if you don't mind sharing that GitHub link. So we're not going to build the thing from scratch. I'm going to basically go through all the steps because if we built it from scratch, we'd be here for at least another hour. So I want to go through the steps, but if you look at a keys plugin, if you look at my plugin for button icons, if you look at this other one for reversing column direction, you'll start to see patterns. There are certain filters that are always being used. There's certain hooks that are always being used. There's certain ways of going about developing these plugins that are virtually the same. So if you have an idea for an extension plugin, you can often just kind of take one of these that already exists, copy it, and then switch out the pieces that you need to modify things for your own. So it's nice that we have a fairly formulaic way of doing this, and hopefully it makes it easier for people to build additional ones. So let's hop over to, I'm going to come in here. I'm going to switch over to the 2024 theme. So my variations and my block styles do not inadvertently mess with the plugin that I'm going to build. And we're going to turn on this plugin that I built called Enable Column Direction. Back over here to Pages, and we'll come back to our example. Now, let's take a look at the end result, and then we'll see how it was built. So if I come over here to my column, now you can see that I have this toggle right below stack on mobile that says reverse direction on mobile. So from a user, I think it's fairly elegant, personally. They're both related to mobile, they're two toggles, and they're right next to each other. So from a user perspective, it's like, oh, this feels very native. It feels very part of the core block. Maybe this is not something that is, so just some quick context. There's actually a PR open right now on adding this functionality in core. But right now, we try and not have any front-end JavaScript in blocks, and just doing this reversal with CSS has some accessibility issues, which we'll actually fix with this extension. So that PR is currently being a bit hung up in core. So in the meantime, you can build a block extension plugin. But hopefully this is something I'd love to see in core if we can, come up with an accessible way to do it. But I just wanted, but that should not detract from this example, but hopefully we can see some of the stuff in core. So when we do this now, we update, go to our tablet, and we can see that the image is on top. And we'll do the same thing on the front end. So let's take a look at how this plugin is built, walk through the steps, and then go from there. All right, so I'm gonna close this and we'll open this. All right, let's take a quick look at the structure of this plugin. Now, the first thing to notice is that there is a build process. This plugin is using a build process. And this will be very common when you are building either blocks or when you're building extensions for the editor. And almost always, I cannot think of a reason why you wouldn't. You will be using the WP scripts package. There's a great article in the documentation on getting started with WP scripts that helps you, get started with WP scripts. And once you get familiar with how to set up WP scripts, either in a plugin, that's the most common case, but also set it up in a theme, this will start to feel very common, this approach. Basically, we have our package.json, we've included WP scripts, and it comes with a whole bunch of commands that we can use. The way this works is we have a source folder. These are all of our files that we're going to be editing, and these are written often in JSX, in React, and then our build process converts that into standard JavaScript in our build folder. And the files in our build folder are the actual files that are getting queued in the editor, the ones that are actually used by the browser to add our functionality. But you could never write this long string. So we write them in a better format like here, and then apply that. Our build process handles building it, and then we apply that on the front end. So you're always going to work out of your source folder, and then you're going to use commands like here. We're going to do npm run start, and this will start our build process. Now, again, that was the quickest explanation, maybe not even an explanation ever. I encourage you to check out Getting Started with WP Scripts. And we're also working on some fundamentals articles around block development, which also apply to extension plugins that will be in the Getting Started section of the Block Editor Handbook, which is going to provide a lot more resources on, how to set up a build process. What does it mean? What does a build process mean? How to work with modern JavaScript. So I don't want to go into too much of that now, but keep a close eye on the Getting Started section of the Block Editor Handbook, really trying hard to add a lot of those resources there. But let's take a look at the basic, the plugin file. So this is our normal plugin. And the first thing that we're doing is we are enqueuing a bunch of scripts and styles. If you remember closely, when we enqueued the style sheet for the block variations, we use this enqueue block editor assets. This is used when you want to include styles or scripts that affect the editor, not the content of the editor. So if you look at the editor, this is JavaScript that impacts like the sidebar, toolbar, but not the actual content of the page, not the content of the block, the kind of the wrapper of the editor. So that's what you're going to be using this for. And I'll go into what is in each of these styles, in the scripts and the styles. Next, we're actually enqueuing a block style. We did before in the theme, where we're enqueuing a block style sheet, forgive me, for the core columns block, and we have block styles. So if we look over here in our build folder, we have styles. You can see, ignore this, but you can see this is the same CSS that we had in our block style. So doing the same thing with that. And then we're going to be doing a bit more with JavaScript. We'll talk about that in a second. And then on the front end, we're modifying the front end of the block with this render block hook. Talk about that in a second. Let's start with the editor and show you how I built this functionality. And then we'll talk about the front end last. So in our source folder, we have this index.jss file. What we're going to start with is, in order for this toggle to exist, when someone clicks this, we need to save the value of this toggle. It needs to be saved somewhere. And the way we do that is with block attributes. So if we look at, this is going to look a little messy, but if we look at our, okay, we are right here. This is our columns block. If you look here, we have a line, we have style, we have class name. These are block attributes. And you can see that there's one here called is reverse direction on mobile. This is the custom one that I added. Basically, we need to add an attribute to the block for our custom extension that will store the value of should this block be reversed on mobile or not. So how we're going to do that is with a hook called blocks.register block type. And this is a hook that you can use to modify the settings of a block in the client, in the editor. So you can see here, we're first making sure that the name of the block is core columns. If it's not core columns, just ignore it. Just keep going. Just return the settings. But if it is the core columns block, we've defined a new attribute called is reverse direction on mobile, type Boolean, default is false. And then we're passing that to the block. We're updating the attributes section of the settings by adding our custom attribute. So with this hook, the columns block now can support a new attribute called is reverse direction on mobile. At this point, there's no functionality added other than that this block now supports the attribute. If you didn't do this, you could add the toggle and nothing would ever get saved. You need this to make sure that WordPress knows and the block knows that it can support this attribute and to save it when it gets set. That's the first step. And you know, in certain cases, you might need multiple attributes to do what you're trying to do. Here, we just need one. The next thing we need to do is we actually need to build the toggle. We need to build the interface for the user to toggle things on and off. So what we're going to do with that is we're going to actually use another hook called editor block edit. And this allows you to filter the block edit component and add things like inspector controls. So again, we have some properties and we're checking the name to make sure that we're actually editing the core columns block. If not, just return the block edit component. But if we are editing the core columns block, we can pull out our attributes and set attributes. And we can, from the attributes, we can get that custom attribute that we've assigned. Then what we're going to do is we're just going to use a bunch of internal controls. Another thing, whenever you're building a block or extension plugin or whatever, trying to use as many internal core components as possible. So in this case, we don't have to build our own toggle control. There's a toggle control that is already included in WordPress. If we come up here, we can see how we're importing different components, different components. Now, for those that may not be familiar with inspector controls, this is actually a slot. Yes, it's actually a slot. And so anything that you put inside of that will be visible in the settings sidebar of the block. So if we come over here, let me go back here. This is the settings sidebar. And so whenever you add something into inspector controls, here I can do this. Testing. We'll save. Refresh here. There's some styling, so it's a little hard to see, but you can see how it's added here in testing. So anything that you add into this inspector control, it will get added to the settings sidebar of the block. So what are we adding to the settings sidebar? Well, I'm adding a div. I'm just a custom div. And then inside of that, I'm using the toggle control. Now the toggle control has a label. If it's checked, if our custom attribute is true or false. And then it has an on change, which is basically whenever someone checks the toggle, it is setting our attribute. Basically, you're setting the reverse of whatever the attribute is. So if it's false, it's turning it true. If it's true, it's turning it false. And that's what we're using with set attributes there. And that's it. Now I do have some custom CSS here. Let me just show you here. Well, before I get to that, this structure of assigning attributes, creating the UI to set those attributes, and then once the attributes on the block, then you can use them to either modify functionality, do whatever. That is a tried and true recipe for extending a core block. Create a custom attribute, create the UI to set that attribute, and then once you have that attribute, then you can do something with it. That's something that you will always follow whenever you're extending a core block, or almost always follow whenever you're extending a core block. This is not needed at all, but what I did here is because I put this in a div and I gave it a custom class, I added a little bit of custom CSS to make it look a little bit better. We can turn this off and I'll show you what this looks like without it. See how this is, it doesn't quite look right, right? So when you build a custom extension, sometimes you might need to add a little bit of CSS to make it look like the admin interface. And so what I've done here is I've just added some padding. Now, what I've done is I've used the inspector to figure out what is the padding here that the core is using, and it's 16 pixels. And then this one is a little hacky, and I'm a little embarrassed, but I just cannot stand the fact that these two toggles are so far apart. So I added a little bit of negative margin on the top to make things look a little better and make it look a little bit more native. And now you can see that it all looks as it should with a core interface. But up until this point, we haven't actually added any functionality. We haven't actually added the reversing functionality. We've added the UI that a user can use to change it, but we haven't actually added the functionality to the block itself. So let's come back over to our index file. And as we scroll down here, we're going to use another hook called editor blockless block.
Nick, can I just interrupt you for a second? Sorry,
yeah.
there's a question in chat. Does inspector controls control in which tab the settings are set? Like, for example, in the styles tab? I think that's a great question.
It is a fantastic question. I don't have the link handy, but what you can do here is I think is it group or tab?
Group, I think. It's group. I think
Styles?
It's group. I'll look that up.
I'm doing this off the top of my head, but let's see if this works. Yeah, so you can determine what, yeah. Okay, so see it down here? So you can, with this group parameter, you can determine like what panel it's on. I will note that you cannot control the order, which is a long-standing issue. So for example, see how this gets put at the bottom? I can't just put it in between typography and color. It gets put where it gets put, which is a little bit unfortunate, but it's an open issue. It's something that's just the way it is. So something to be aware of, but yes, you can determine what panel it's on. If you look, there's a great developer note. This was relatively recent, I think 6.3 maybe, where you could do this. That's when the tabs were implemented, or maybe it was 6.2. Either way, there was a way to do that for sure.
It was 6.3. Justin dropped a link to a developer blog article that sort of goes over the inspector. The inspector sidebar groups is what's the technical term, I guess.
Yeah. And hopefully someday we'll have ordering.
Yeah. Tell me.
Ryan might be working on that.
Yeah, it's literally my pull request.
Exactly. Okay, so this one, I love this hook, and what it allows you to do, it allows you to modify the wrapper of the block in the editor. So in our previous examples, we've always added a class to additional CSS classes. That is perfectly fine, but it also introduces the potential for a user unexpectedly to remove that somehow. It provides the opportunity for the things to get messed up when it's unexpected. So whenever I'm adding a class, because we're still adding a class at this point, whenever we're adding a class, I like to do it using the editor.blocklistBlock functionality, because it adds the class to the block and the user doesn't know. It's not accessible for them to remove that that class. It's all done kind of behind the scenes in the editor. Now, there's a downside to this where it only adds it in the editor, and you need to add the class on the front end as well. We'll tackle that in a minute. So there's pros and cons to both approaches, but this is one that I personally use quite a bit. And it works very much the same way as the other filters. You know, here we're checking to make sure that we're editing the columns block, and also making sure that the attribute of the is reverse direction on mobile is actually set. Because if it's not set, then we don't even, then why add the class? So if it's neither of those two, we just return the normal block list. And if it is true, then basically we're updating the class name prop on the block list block component, and which will add our class to it. Again, basically it's the same idea of adding that class and additional classes, additional CSS classes, but it's doing it behind the scenes. I just really like this approach, but there is a downside. If you want it, if you need it on the front end, you need to do it on the front end too. Let's refresh here. So up until this point, we have everything that we need in the editor. Well, I think I still have my group. We'll get rid of this group. Refresh. Okay. Tablet, and you can see that we have our classes applied behind the scenes to the wrapper on the block. I think we can probably see this. Core columns. Oh, turn this off. Date. Double check that everything's working. Yep, it is working, and we don't have our class here. So behind the scenes is adding the class, and then we have our CSS here, our index.css. That's just load, you know, the same styles that we had before. That's reversing that direction. Now we need to tackle the front end because everything right now is in the editor. We don't have anything on the front end. So to do that, what we're going to use is my favorite hook of all time. It is the render block hook. And this is we're going to go back to PHP for. And this is a hook that allows you to modify the front end output of any block. For those that have used my block visibility plugin, the entire plugin is built off this one hook because it basically takes any block, then you can look at the attributes that are on that block and then do whatever you want with it. So in this case, what we're doing is we're actually using a modified version of the render block hook, the one where you can specify exactly the block you're looking to modify. You could also just use the normal render block like this, but then you need to check for the block type that you actually want to modify. This is a little bit easier. You can actually specify the name of the block that you want to modify and just use that straight out. So what we're doing here is this hook gets the block's content and then the block block object, which has like its attributes and everything. So we're basically checking to see if that attribute is set. If it is not set, we're just going to return the block content. We don't want to modify anything. If it is set, we want to add the class of is reverse direction on mobile. And this is a fun one because before you need to use a bunch of rejects and all this stuff to make this work. But now we have the HTML tag processor, which was released in 6.3, I think. And this makes it really easy. So if you haven't checked out the tag processor, we can share a link in the chat. A really great way of modifying tags in the front end or in PHP instead of having to use complicated rejects. So instead of something more complicated, all I need to do is pass in my block content, progress to the next tag, and then that would be the wrapper element on the block, and then add a class. And that's what we're doing here. We're adding the class. Then you just get the updated HTML from the tag processor. And that's our new block content. And then we're returning our block content. So basically what we're doing here is if the attribute for reverse direction on mobile is set to true, add this class, return the block content with the added class. So it looks more complicated than it is, but that's all that we're doing here. So if we come over here and look at this in the front end, fingers crossed my live coding works, and there it goes. And we still have our image switcher from Aki's plugin as well. So you can now see here that we have an image on top. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that there's some accessibility problems with this. And the main problem with this is that if we look at our columns, if you're on a screen reader and you're progressing through the DOM, you hit the text first because that's the first item in the DOM tree. But it's actually the second thing visually. So we have a difference between the logical order of how the page is displayed. So while this approach of reversing columns might be fine if you're doing like decorative elements and things like that, when you're dealing with content, ideally, you don't want to have this. You actually want to have the order of the DOM the same as what it is visually. So even though the CSS method that I've shown so far can get you pretty far in many situations, ideally that you want to have a more robust solution that's going to have to use front-end JavaScript that will actually reverse the order of those columns if this class is set. So that is not something that you can easily do. Well, you can with a variation or a block style, but I guess you can't do it with both, but it's because we have this plugin that's reversing the column direction. It's easy to build in that JavaScript right within the plugin for that. So I am not the best vanilla JavaScript developer at all, but ChatGPT is actually fantastic. So in preparation for this presentation, I asked ChatGPT to write me some code that reverses the column direction if the is reverse direction on mobile is set. So you can take a look in the GitHub repository at this code. I am sure it's not the most optimal code in the world, but it does work. And so I wanted to show that off here and how you would modify this, what we just built, into something that uses the front-end JavaScript to actually handle that column switching. The key here is that this will not work in the editor. So you'd still be using the CSS in the editor to visually to show the change. But on the front end, which users are going to see when they visit your site, that will actually be correct and handle the JavaScript. So if we come back over here to our plugin file, we're going to make a few modifications. The first thing is we don't need to register a block style anymore because the block style is what was powering the CSS. The CSS, it was providing the CSS that did the switch. We don't need that anymore. So we're going to comment this out. We now need to enqueue some JavaScript on the front end that does this switching. We're going to just use the normal WP enqueue scripts for that. And the last thing that we need to do is that when you enqueue a block, when you register a block style, that block style is handled, registered or provides the styles both in the front end and the editor. By turning this off, we no longer have styles in the editor. The way we fix this is by enqueuing those styles directly in the editor. Now, this is actually a brand new hook that was introduced in 6.3. This is, and there's a great article, which I think may have been shared earlier, about enqueuing assets in the editor, and it explains the difference between enqueue block assets and the one that we used before for all of the UI stuff, which was enqueue block editor assets. And the way to think about this is that enqueue block editor assets is enqueuing assets for the editor itself, like the settings sidebar, the toolbars, all that kind of stuff. Enqueue block assets is enqueuing assets for the content of the page, for the blocks on the page, not the editor elements. So because we want to enqueue these styles for the block itself, because it's targeting the block itself, we use enqueue block assets instead of enqueue block editor assets. A little bit of nuance there that has been tricky. So now what we're going to do is we just need to enqueue that style sheet in the editor. So the styles work in the editor. And then that's it. We have our JavaScript on the front end that's handling the switching. We have our CSS in the editor that's handling the switching. And now if we save this, and we cross our fingers. Now when we look at this, it still works. And this is now being handled by JavaScript instead of by CSS. So now when we look at this, we can see that the first element is actually the image, and the second element is the text. And let me see if I can make this look better. And when we bring this out, you can see that if you look closely right here, you can see that the order changes, and that's handled by our JavaScript. So that is it. That is a very basic extension plugin for something that may or may not be included in Core in the future, but is a very handy feature to have. It is something that you shouldn't need to build a custom block for. And it's all, I think, fairly invisible to the user. It feels like part of the UI. We're using Core components. It looks right where it should be, and adds some nice functionality that you might need on your site. So we are basically at time here.
So a question in chat.
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, there's a question in chat. It looks like the JS isn't queued on every page. I know there isn't a WP enqueue block script, but what is the recommended way to only load JS when a specific core block is present on the page? From Mark.
Paying good attention. Yes, it is loaded on every page. I actually don't have an answer to that. I'm not even sure that there is a way. And as I was putting this together, I was like, oh, that would be really neat, because we don't actually have a similar instead of, like, you could imagine like enqueue block script, right? That would only enqueue whenever that block is available. There might be a way to do it. I honestly don't know. So if anybody does know, I'd love to update the
Off the top of my head. Off the top of my head, you could do something like use like render block. You can enqueue you could register a JavaScript file and then enqueue it in the render block.
Oh, that's
that might be a way of doing it. Because that's the way you used to have to do it with dynamic blocks. If you had front end JavaScript, you needed to enqueue the JavaScript or the JavaScript in your render callback. So you might be able to do it in your render call, your render block.
Oh, that's a great idea.
That's what I would try. Because then that's guaranteed to totally run if that thing's running.
Yeah, so that's where you put it in here. So this render block function, you'd put it, you'd register the block. No, you
could probably run the enqueue here if you wanted, but if you could enqueue it elsewhere. Sorry, you could register the script earlier and then just run the enqueue of that script at this point, and then that way you'd have to ensure that your dependencies were all in place. But
that's a really good option as well. Yeah, so there's definitely things that could be improved here, but hopefully, I know we're a bit over time, but just to close this out, hopefully that kind of gives you the general structure. We're using render block to modify the block content on the front end. In the editor, we're using the blocks, register block type, to add the attributes that we need. Then we're using the editor block edit to modify the UI, add our UI elements to the settings sideboard, the toolbar. And then this is kind of an extra one if you want to modify the wrapper element around the block in the editor using the editor block list block. With these 4 hooks, I guess, you can do a heck of a lot in terms of modifying the existing block and then modifying the content on the front end. So if you are interested in extending blocks or this discussion or building your own, please feel free to reach out to us in the WordPress Slack, on Twitter, wherever. We are both all developer advocates, and we want to help people build for the editor and build with blocks as much as possible. So hopefully you found this useful. Hopefully the laundry list of links provides some good resources on how to build this stuff as well. And thank you all so much for coming. And we will see you, hopefully, in the next developer hours. So I mentioned briefly that this plugin is powered by WP scripts. We're going to do a developer hours in December, I believe on the 19th, that is all about WP scripts. And we're actually going to dive in a bit more deeply on like how to set it up, what's the best way to do it. For example, right here, I'm using a custom Webpack configuration with WP scripts that is pretty, you use this a lot when you're building things. But as a new developer, this was, foreign completely to me. So we're going to try and cover all the important nuances of using WP scripts in that session. So we hope to see you there. And as always, developer hours, we try to do once a month. And if you have ideas for what you'd like to see in developer hours, things you'd like to cover, again, please reach out to us and let us know. So anything else you can think of, Ryan, to close us out?
No, I don't think so. Just to mirror what you said, like we're always available for DMs or whatever if you have questions about the stuff, because it can get pretty in the weeds pretty fast. But yeah, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. All right, have a great day.